Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Ahmet Kuru.
Alaikum salam, Ahmet T.
Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Ahmed. I know this has been a wonderful opportunity to talk to you and about your book, Islam, Authoritarianism, uh, uh, and Underdevelopment. You have written a very provocative book, and I'm sure it has been hailed as well as, it has obviously ruffled some feathers also. But ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, Pakistan, and welcome to Heather Mehdi's Perspectives. Today we have as our guest Dr. Ahmet T. Kuru. Dr. Ahmed is a professor of political science at the San Diego University, and he has written several books. One of them is The Secularism and State, Policies Towards Religion, looking at United States, France, and Turkey. And then he also co-authored another book called Democracy, Islam, and Secularism in Turkey. His articles have appeared all over the world in prestigious journals like the World Politics, Comparative Politics, and Political Science Quarterly. But today we are going to be talking about his monumental book. I call it a seminal book, once in a lifetime, once in a century book. It's almost Chomskian proportions in the terms of the insight that he's brought to an extremely important subject, which has involved everyone in the Muslim and the non-Muslim world. And this book has also been the co-winner of the American Political Science Association's International History and Political Section book. And it's been translated into Arabic, Bosnian, Chinese, French, Indonesian, and Turkish. And hopefully, Dr. Ahmed, once we're done with this, it'll also be translated into Urdu. I want to start with a brief description of your book, so people know that the context. Why is this book such a major contribution to the literature of Islam authoritarianism, and why the Muslim world is underdeveloped? And I think one of the big things that the book says is that why do Muslim countries today exhibit higher levels of authoritarianism and low levels of socioeconomic development in comparison to world averages? You criticize traditional explanations pointing to why this status disparity happens, because you also say that philosophically and socioeconomically, intellectually, between the 9th and the 12th century, the Muslim world was far superior to Western Europe. Nor do you say Western colonialism is the cause of this downfall, because Muslims had suffered political and socioeconomic problems when colonization began, so that already pre-existed. You also argue that Muslims had very influential thinkers and merchants in the early history when religious orthodoxy and military rule were prevalent in Europe. So that's a very interesting insight. But you say, starting in the 11th century, mid-11th century, there was an alliance that started to happen between the orthodox Islamic scholars, the Ulema, in Pakistan, we call them the Mullah, and the military states that began to emerge. And this alliance, you postulate, hindered intellectual and economic creativity by marginalizing, very interesting, by marginalizing the intellectual and the bourgeois class, which is really the merchant class of the Muslim world. And then this study links this historical explanation to present day contemporary politics in the Muslim world, and where still this ulama state alliance continues to strengthen and grow, and it is preventing creativity and competition in Muslim countries. So that is a huge postulation, Dr. Ahmed. So I will now give you the floor to share your brief perspective on what the key elements of the book, and then we will go into a question answer session. Over to you, Dr. Ahmed. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure and honor to be in Haydar Mehdi's Perspectives program. And thank you for your generous words. You're very kind. Let me start with some PowerPoint slides I prepared for introducing the book. And after this short presentation, I'll be happy to have a conversation with you.
Thank you.
So, as you mentioned, there is a set of problems in the Muslim world. Sometimes people try to ignore it. in the West, some scholars try to ignore because they don't want to be labeled as Orientalists or Islamophobes. In the Muslim world, people sometimes want to cover up and ignore because they think that if we talk about the problems, uh, people will hate Muslim culture. Already there is an Islamophobia. But I assume myself as a medical doctor, if there is a patient coming to you with a sickness, illness, you can ignore it. You can say, oh, you are perfectly healthy. How do we know there are problems? We look at the data. So let me show you that in terms of the data of Freedom House, which is the main data set on authoritarian and democratic regimes, 60% of all countries in the world fulfill the basic requirements of being electoral democracy with elections.
Mhm.
Whereas in the Muslim world, unfortunately, 14% instead of 60%. There's a big gap between world average and Muslim world average. What do I mean by Muslim world? There are 49 Muslim majority countries out of 195 or so countries in the world. So therefore, 1/4 of all countries are Muslim majority. And they have a big problem of authoritarianism is as seen in the map and data. Then we look at socioeconomic development criteria. One is GNI per capita, which is gross national income per person. And the Muslim world again has the average of $9,000, whereas the world average $14,000. And please remember that this is despite the fact that 60% of world's oil reserves are in the Muslim lands.
Mhm.
So if you put oil money aside, the GNIPC of the Muslim world average is even lower.
Wow. Yeah.
And look at the other data, literacy rate, schooling, life expectancy, showing us socio-economic development. Average only 7.5 around in the Muslim world, 73%, whereas the world 84. Then schooling, 5.8 years versus 7.5. And life expectancy also there's a gap. So what explains? Why do we see that? And I would like to emphasize that I am not comparing the Muslim world with Western countries, because if we do, the gap is even much bigger.
Mhm.
So in the literature and even in the daily life, people have answers. You don't have to be a social scientist to grapple with this question. And for some people, the problem is Islam. This is not simply Western critiques, but even in my home country, Turkey, where I was born, even in many Arab countries, there are people blaming Islam for the problems Muslims have had.
But you don't say that.
I don't say that, but I take their critics very seriously, starting with Max Weber, who criticize Islam, Samuel Huntington, who claims there is a clash of civilizations, Bernard Lewis, a big critic of Islam, all the way to some recent contemporary Arab poets who are blaming Arab culture, Islam for the problems. Why do I criticize them? Throughout the book, I engage a critical dialogue, but my basic arguments are the following. Islam was perfectly compatible with development and philosophy and science from 8 to mid-11, maybe 8 to 12 centuries. So Islam contributed the golden era, and therefore there was no such incompatibility between Islam and development for centuries, long time.
Nearly
This
300,
is
350 years, Islam and Muslim ascendancy was aligned.
and yeah, it was very obvious that Muslims were superior to Western Europeans in science and philosophy and urban life.
Mhm.
Europe had neither a city like Baghdad nor a philosopher like Ibn Sina for until Renaissance. This is the first argument blaming Islam, and it is historically not true. It leads people to racism, having a xenophobia against Muslims. It's problematic, even ideologically very problematic. And there are, of course, Muslim countries with democratization and prosperity. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, when we compare Muslim countries with Christian countries,
Mhm.
Muslims are better off.
Mhm.
Senegal, Mali, Niger, certain Muslim countries have better democratization score than Christians in sub-Saharan Africa. Therefore, we have to look at political institutions, historical trajectory, rather than simply blaming religion.
So
This is one thing.
you have a slide that shows that beyond this slide?
Yes, so the slide explains how essentialists blame Islam. This is one argument we engage. The second argument, anti-colonial argument.
Uh-huh.
If we ask people in the Middle East, they blame the West. They say it's all about Western imperialism, colonization. Some went all the way back to Crusaders, and always Europeans and Westerns came to colonize, dominate. This is the problem. I am also critical. Throughout the book, I engage with the issue. Of course, Crusader and Mongol destructions were obvious.
Mhm.
Of course, Western imperialism has been detrimental. Colonizers destroy institutions. But the problems began before Western colonization in the Muslim world.
So
That's why Western imperialists were able to dominate so easily, because Muslims institutionally, philosophically, economically started to face a stagnation already before the 18th century. Then came 18th century Western colonization, is more an effect rather than the cause.
Mhm.
This is the second. The third one is more scientific approach, new institutionalism. Recently, Dara Nacemoğlu and some famous economists wrote books saying that it's neither religion nor colonization, but all about institutions. If you have good institutions, you have development. Good means inclusive, participatory. And bad institutions means extractive institutions, exploitative institutions, you have underdevelopment. I give some credits, but I also ask who built the institutions, who makes the good or bad institutions.
Mhm.
So my own approach is that it's not religion, it's human beings and certain class of human beings. It's not colonization per se, but Muslims' own internal problems with internal agency. It's not institutions, but certain peoples who built these institutions. And I look at four main groups of human beings, four main classes of people. At the beginning, when we have the golden era, Muslims had two productive classes, intellectual class and the bourgeoisie, the economic class. They were very creative, innovative, successful. Whereas at that time in Western Europe, there was neither an intellectual class nor an economic class. Western Europe, throughout these Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, was dominated by clergy and the state. You
This is
can
the
call
Roman
it
Catholic.
monarchy, aristocracy. Go ahead, please.
This is the Roman Catholic Church, which was dominant.
Dominant and ally with Holy Roman Emperor, German kings, Frank kings, local aristocrats, state and clergy. Whereas in the Muslim world, intellectuals and merchants, and intellectuals include Muslim scholars like Abu Hanifa and secular philosophers like Farabi. So this is my argument, how I put the historical context. So if or audience look at this slide, you see that I try to divide the recent history into three phases: Muslim supremacy, comparable level of development, then Western supremacy.
Ah.
I think this is important because some people, they assume that after the Muslim golden era came automatically Western supremacy, which is not true. For
Mhm.
example, scientifically, Ibn Rushd died at the end of the 12th century, and after that, Muslims were no longer superior. But Muslims and Europeans were comparable until Galileo and Kepler. After 1600 or so, came Western supremacy. Therefore, in between, as you see in this slide,
So
there
what?
is a long period of comparable level from 1200 to around 1700.
Mhm.
So it's a long process. Things didn't change overnight. Muslims were philosophically very powerful, productive. From the Baghdad schools, 800, to the death of Ibn Rushd. Then came comparable level, followed by Western supremacy in the recent centuries.
This
Economically, for example,
Western.
Muslims were able to mint silver and gold coin, whereas at that time, the Europeans use either Abbasi dinar and copies of it or Byzantium dinar. Europe did not have gold or silver coin. They did not have monetary economy based on the coin they use. For example, we have today in British Museum a gold coin written in it, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, with mistakes. They were not able to write correctly. So when you look at it, how come an English king mint that coin? Did he become a Muslim? Did he convert? No. It's like copying US dollar today, a fake dollar. So they produce in England a fake Abbasi dinar because of its prestige.
Wow.
People trust Abbasi dinar, but
So
they
what you
didn't trust an English dinar. Yes.
what you're saying is that the Western kings actually copied the Abbasid dinar with the La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah because
Yes.
it happened to be the most prestigious exchange holding power money.
Exactly. This
Wow,
is
this is
fascinating,
very
right?
interesting. Mm.
Yeah, and it's in British Museum now. So from that time until 1250, Muslims were very economically powerful. Then came the rise of European city-states, European economy, a comparable level than European and Western European supremacy. So let's skip the military part. We don't have time to
No,
get
no,
in
please go.
all the
That's okay.
details.
We'll do a quick recap. So the
Yeah,
Muslim,
then you see that here until the Crusaders, definitely a Muslim military supremacy, then a comparable level. Then I put 1764, 1774 because of two events. One was the Russian defeat of the Ottomans and capturing Crimea, the first Muslim land taken from the Ottomans by a non-Muslim. The second was the British defeat of the Mughal emperor in, I think, in Bengal region,
yes, yes. Yes,
1764, a
Muhammad
major
Salah.
war between Britain and the Muslim forces, which seal the British military supremacy in the subcontinent. So
Yeah.
these two events show their supremacy.
This is the Battle of Plassey against Siraj.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. So now, how do I explain the agents behind these transformations? I look at the classes, and in the early period, early Islamic history, two class of people, independent scholars and the merchants. They were the main motors, engines of Muslim success. But after 1050, Muslim world started to look like Western Europe of Middle Ages under the dominance of the clergy. We call them Mullah or Ulema, and in alliance with the state authority. So what do I mean by independent scholars? From the 8th to mid 11th century, Islamic scholars like Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Shafi, Ibn Hanbal pay attention to autonomy, independence, to put a distance with political authority. Because after the war between Ali and Muawiyah, Siffin civil war, there emerged the Umayyad dynasty by persecuting the Prophet's grandsons, Hassan and Hussein and other family members. which created the image of political authority as secular in a way that the Caliph of Umayyads and Abbasids no longer represent a religious authority. They were political authority per se. One exception which proves the rule was Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. And Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was perhaps the only pious Umayyad caliph. Religious people love him even today, but he was allowed to rule only 2 years. It's reported that other members of Umayyad dynasty poisoned him to death. So this is an exception to prove the rule. A pious caliph, religiously respected. Others were more secular leaders, and ulama, which means Islamic scholars, always try to put a distance between themselves and this secular and sometimes oppressive kings, rulers who call themselves caliphs of Umayyads and Abbasids. So, in addition to the scholars, there were philosophers, polymaths, making substantial scientific contributions. Khwarizmi was a mathematician, and he innovated certain formulas and terms we use today. Algebra, the name we use in English, is coming from a book of Al-Khwarizmi. And trigonometry algorithms referring to him. Razi was a major medical doctor who differentiated between certain viruses like chickenpox and smallpox. Ibn al-Haytham was the innovator of dark room, which is the origin of camera obscura today. And Ibn Sina is well known with his philosophical and medical works, read, translated, taught in Europe for 6-7 centuries. Biruni was a polymath. He is interested in astronomy, mathematics, and almost as a modern anthropologist, he wrote a major book on India, language, tradition, religions of India. And they say for 5-6 centuries, that was the best book written available in India at that time.
That's correct.
So these secular philosophers received some patronage from state authorities, but they never became ideological servants. They pursued their science, getting some money from political authorities. Islamic scholars didn't even want that. They say, no, we have to be funded by private sources. And we have a 1970 analysis by Cohen of 3,900 Islamic scholars from 8th to mid-11th century, from Egypt to eastward. And interestingly, he emphasized that ulama at that time were sharply different from Catholic clergy. They were adamant to put a distance between themselves and the state, and 91% of ulama at that time were funded themselves or their families, funded by private sources, mostly commerce. They were merchants or merchant families. Abu Hanifa, for example, was a silk merchant. Ahmed ibn Hanbal, for example, worked in the textile sector. Only 9%, including Abu Hanifa's famous student, Imam Yusuf, work for the state. So there were those who work for the state, but they were a minority, only 9%. Go ahead.
I just want to read a small extract from your book, which I found really interesting on this data that you shared, the 91% working privately and only 9% with the state. You're saying that 22% worked in textile, 13% worked in food, 11% were merchants who made leather, food, etc. And then there were 9% who dealt with ornaments, 8% were bankers, 5% were middlemen, and 5% were book copiers, 8% were teachers. This is amazing. All these ulama, these 4,000 nearly ulama, they were employed in actually gainful professions every day. They were merchants, they were traders, they were bankers, they were teachers, they were tutors. They were not ulama sitting in the masjid, arms and eating halwa with the long beard and asking the state to support them. They were supported themselves or were supported by the bourgeois. So this is a huge thing that you talked about. I just want to leave one question before you go on to the
Sure.
next slide. You talked about the five imams. you know uh, it's a very sad state, and as you write in your book that the five Imams, Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi, Hanbal, and Jafar Sadiq, they were all either killed or poisoned, and they refused to serve the state. Imam Abu Hanifa died in prison. Imam Malik was whipped. Imam Shafi was detained and changed. Ibn Hanbal was beaten in prison, and Imam Jafar Sadiq was poisoned to death. So we have even the ulama, the leading luminaries and the lights of the Muslim world their times, who we follow, the five schools, the four Sunni mazhabs and the one Shia, were brutalized by the state.
Yes, that's very important, interesting. The ulama's private funding was important for at least two main reasons. One, to have an independent mind rather than justifying whatever king does. You defend moral principles and stand for ethics and morality, ahlak. Second, if you are having a private job, it means you are in daily life. You are not isolated from quote unquote real life. A mullah sitting in the mosque, if receive a question about trade, only has a theoretical knowledge about commerce and trade. Whereas Abu Hanifa, when he was asked a question, he knew what he was answering because he was already part of markets. He was already part of daily activities of ordinary people. This was very important. And despite the persecutions you referred to, they kept their position. They
Independent.
didn't give up. Yeah. And they became an important model for a long time, for centuries. Even in the mid 11th century, when the ulama state alliance started to emerge, Ghazali was a part of it. But even Ghazali remember the ideal of early previous scholars. That's why in the midlife crisis around the age 40, he went to the graveyard of Prophet Abraham and regrets that he served the state, he taught in state-fund madrasa, he received public money, and he took an oath. He took an oath that he would never receive state money again. So even in the 11th century, Ghazali, with his full support to Ulema State Alliance, he still was unhappy with the fact that he had some connections and he regretted, and he went to Prophet Abraham to take an oath to never repeat it again. This is very important, I think.
I'm going to park a Ghazali question for later.
Of course, of
Let you
course.
proceed. Let you proceed.
Sure. So then what happened after this golden era? Muslim independent scholars, merchants, unlike Western Europe, they were productive for 4 or 5 centuries. Then came mid 11th century.
So that's your next slide, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So the mid 11th century had both economic reasons behind the transformation and religious reasons behind it.
Dr.
So,
Ahmed, I think your next slide hasn't come in. Can you just move it?
yeah,
Right?
for some reason, it shows
It's stuck.
us that it's in process. Let me try. Hmm. And okay.
Yeah. So maybe you can stop your slide share and
Yeah, that's a good idea. Stop the share. Okay. And then Bismillah, share screen again.
yes. And then the next slide, maybe we will get there. If not, it's
For
okay.
some reason, yeah, this is corrupted. Let me one more try. Stop here.
Okay.
Share the screen. Share from the other side. Not that one.
And you can go down to the slide from here. You can go down on your,
Yeah.
yeah, go down to
Mhm.
slide number 5 or 6, I think.
Yeah. Let me, yeah, PowerPoint not responding.
Okay.
Don't worry, we'll close it.
So we will
But it's in my mind. I'll be
and
able to explain
you
everything.
can share with us. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the mid 11th century, let me try again. So in the mid 11th, let me explain and try simultaneously. In the mid 11th century, there was the ICTA system emerging, which is the distribution of land and land revenues. Instead of paying salaries of state officials by cash, the state started to distribute them land in a semi-feudal, not completely feudal, but semi-feudal system. This is the economic transformation beginning in Abbasids, then Buyuts, and then the Seljuks came, the Seljuk Empire in mid-11th century, established this new economic model by limiting private ownership of land. And this marginalized landowners, private, and also had a very negative impact on the merchants. So when the merchants lost their powerful status, the Muslim scholars, ulama, and other scholars needed a source of funding. And then the new source of funding came with state. A very influential Seljuk Grand Vizier Nizam al-Mulk established a series of madrasas
Okay.
called Nizamiya madrasas.
Yeah.
Are you now seeing this, my
Yes,
slide?
you can now go down
Yes.
to your slide. Yes.
Yes. Now you see my map here.
Yes.
This map shows us that in the mid-11th century, in addition to economic transformation by the land revenue distribution iqta system, in addition to establishment of the Nizamiya madrasas to fulfill the funding from state to ulama, there was a Shia-Sunni polarization.
So, Dr. Ahmed,
Because,
if you go to the bottom of your slide, yeah, click here. That's good.
okay, now
So just
you
want to
see here,
you said that the state started an iqta system, which was to give kind of jagirs or fiefdoms or areas
exactly.
of property to people so that they could get revenue, and in exchange they were asked to provide military soldiers, and therefore the merchant class which was left behind. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly.
Okay.
In the late Abbasi era, because of some economic crisis, they moved from monetary economy, this iqta system, more state-based, state allocation of land.
Okay.
This is one thing which was developed by Seljuks and other Muslim empire, all the way Ottoman's empires. This is the economic transformation negatively impacted merchants and independent scholars.
Okay.
Plus, there was the Sunni Shia tension because in the early 11th century, as you see in the map, Fatimids in North Africa, Karmatis in Arabian Peninsula, Hamdanis in today's Syria, Buyuts in Iraq, they were all Shia dynasties.
Okay.
And they control these areas, including Baghdad itself. They only allow the Abbasi Caliph remain almost as if like the Pope in Vatican today.
Okay.
In a small place, symbolic power, no treasury, no army almost. But Abbasi caliphs were not happy. and two of them rule 50 years as symbolic powers, Qadir and Qaim, father and son. This Qadir, look at the east. What did he see? Karahanids, Samanids, Ghaznavids, Turks, nomadic powers in today's some part of Pakistan, Central Asia. And then he said, why don't I call them to empower me again? And he knew Qadir Abbasi Caliph in Baghdad that he also had some Sunni masses all around Iraq and Iran. Therefore, he announced a creed, a declaration of faith in order to unify all Sunnis. He said, Shias who criticize Aisha are infidels. Mu'tazila, who said the Quran was not eternal word of God, but it was a creation of God, are infidels. The Muslims who do not pray 5 times a day are infidels. So this was a very important, obvious and notorious declaration with a caliph, political purposes and aims in his mind. And he wanted the Mahmud of Ghaznavi and other Sunni sultans ally with him and defeat all Shia monarchies. And this is the ideological basis. But this is the first time when a Muslim leader declare other Muslims kafir.
So is this the same period of the Ashari Mutazilite battle, the area of Imam Hanbal, Ibn Taymiyyah?
It was later because
that was later.
Later, because Ma'mun, the Abbasi Caliph, who was rationalist and who supported philosophy, made something terrible. He tried to impose his rationalist views, especially Mu'tazila views, that the Quran was a creation of God, to everyone. And he persecuted Ahmet ibn Hanbal and other scholars who said no. It was 9th century. There was the debate, diversity going on. This caliph was defeated ideologically because he died and 2 other caliphs continue, but Mutawakkil, a 4th caliph, changed the policy. Mutawakkil support Ibn Hanbal. You see, until 1050, it was back and forth, struggle, debate, critiques. But after 1050, Seljuk Empire, with its military conquest and military might, with economic basis of Iqta system, and with ideology of Sunni orthodoxy declared by Abbasi caliphs Qadir, then his son Qaim, with a clear enemies, Ismaili Shia, Mu'tazila, philosophers, non-practicing Muslims, declaring them infidel, and very violent manner. Because, for example, the question you ask, Ma'mun, when he had this inquisition against Ibn Hanbal and other Sunni Orthodox scholars, hard to use the term Sunni for that time, but let's say Hanbali.
Yes.
It was a small group of people persecuted, 100 or so. It was still unacceptable, unfortunate, but it's not mass level. It was just about some elite scholars. But the declaration of Qadir for certain Muslims as kafir, it was a mass level declaration. And until today, it has a legacy. Today, when you hear takfir, Qadir has a major role in shaping historically. So this is the reaction to Shia domination by Abbasi Caliph. Then the rise of Ulema state alliance with economic sources, with ideological sources. So ideological factors, Sunni Orthodoxy and Qadiri Creed. Economic factors, the Iqta system. Political factors, the newly emerging military state. Mahmud the Ghaznavi, then the Seljuks, with a new focus on military conquest by nomadic Turkish Central Asian forces. The agents were Abbasi caliphs, Seljuk sultans, Nizamul Mulk, who was the prime minister, Vezir Azam, the Grand Vizier of Selçuks, who established a network of madrasas called Nizamiye madrasas. And then Ghazali, as the genius, the most important production of Nizamiye madrasas and the most important defenders. And Ghazali played a major role by two books. One book declaring Ismaili Shia as infidels, they could be killed, their properties could be confiscated. The other book was very famous, Tahafatul Falasafa,
Yes.
The Incoherence of Philosophers. It was a deep philosophical treatise, but at the end, he has 2 pages, unfortunately, 2 pages of conclusion. Start with a hypothetical fatwa, asking whether the philosophers can be declared infidel to be killed. And he said, for 3 reasons they can. One reason that the philosopher says the word is eternal. The second, they say God's knowledge is limited to macro, big things rather than small macro issues, details. So God is not interested in small details. And then the third thing is the resurrection in the hereafter, Hashir, will be spiritual rather than bodily, physical. So then, according to Ghazali, philosophers are kafir, apostate, because they say the word is eternal, God's knowledge is limited, resurrection, spiritual, not physical. This is very unfortunate fatwa because it was used to oppress philosophy and really limit freedom of thought in the Muslim world. So what is the result? First of all, of course, things didn't change overnight. Even in Central Asia, Iran, Iraq, it took about a century for this system became dominant completely. The result is marginalization of independent scholars and merchants. This model was later embraced by Syria and Egypt under the famous Saladin, who defeated the Crusaders, and Saladin established the Ayyubi dynasty, followed by Mamluk dynasty. Then 3 major Muslim empires, Ottomans, Safavi, and Mughals, especially Ottomans, emulated this model, Ulema state alliance, where the Ulema now are no longer privately funded. They are products of Nizamiya and likewise madrasas, had a strong alliance with the state. And you see the marginalization of independent scholars, intellectuals, marginalization of merchants. The term philosopher became a pejorative term, a very negative term. People stopped using it because of being afraid of declare apostate.
Let me just share please show the slide, but let me just share what you've written. And it's really interesting about Salahuddin Ayyubi because he's also, considered a big hero in Muslim history, and which he was, as a great conqueror. But Salahuddin's anti-philosophical measures, as you write, also included his order for the execution of the philosopher mystic Yahya Sohrawardi. And then later in the Ayyubi dynasty, we have Ashraf, the Sultan of Damascus, who made a statement at the beginning of his reign and prohibited all jurists from studying anything else except the Hadith, the Quran and its exegesis, and law. He made clear that anyone studying logic and other foreign sciences would be banned from the city. So this was a massive crackdown on intellectualism and philosophy and reflection and questioning.
I totally agree with you. Thanks for the references. Let me emphasize 2 points. One is that I hope our audience doesn't perceive me as against Ghazali, against Saladin, against Nizam al-Mulk. No, these are giants. These are big people, big names, made important achievements. But we have to be critical in order to go further. We have to be critical, even these giants, in order to progress. Otherwise, we stand still. But the Prophet encouraged us not to repeat the same thing in 2 days, right? Develop yourself, be better, go further. That's why we are critical of historical
But
figures.
you don't have to be apologetic at all. I think it's a very insightful book and people should read it. And I've read it, obviously, and I've critically read it. So please proceed.
Yeah. And let me tell an anecdote to refresh our audience because this scientific stuff may be a little bit too deep and harsh. Let's have an anecdote.
Mhm.
There was the story that the Muslims destroyed the major ancient library in Alexandria.
Mhm.
And then today we know it's fake. But who produced this story that when Amr ibn al-As, when he conquered Egypt, called Caliph Omar, not called, there was no telephone at that
Yeah,
time.
of course.
So he wrote Omar what to do with the library. He said, if the books are compatible with the Quran, we don't need them, we have Quran. If they are against the Quran, we don't need them, they are against the Quran. In either case, burn them, destroy them. We know that it's a fabricated story,
It's
but
absolutely.
who fabricated the story? Is this an Islamophobe Western scholar, a Christian, a Jew, a Buddhist? No, a Muslim Arab historian fabricated the story. Why did he fabricated the story? Because when Saladin entered Egypt, there was in Cairo, there was a major Fatima library. You know, in Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba,
Yes.
Muslims had libraries of hundreds of thousands of books when Europeans had only few hundred books in their monasteries. And then he sold the books, destroyed the books, perhaps because of monetary necessity, perhaps because of the idea that these are all Ismaili Shia and
Hmm.
it's good to destroy them.
So he
These
used
are
the same rationale and the reason.
exactly. But then the Arab historian, his father was a counselor of Saladin, and they were family of friends of Saladin, produced the story to justify what they did to Fatim Library. And that's really an unfortunate anecdote, tells us many things. So let me briefly mention that the Crusaders and Mongols definitely destructive. Definitely, Timur Crusaders Mongol destroyed many cities like Delhi, Baghdad, Damascus, all the way Central Asia. But they are not the only reason, the main reason of Muslim stagnation, because after these invaders, Muslims establish brilliant empires, Ottoman, Safavi, Mughal. Mughal Muslim minority, but still ruled by Muslims. But they recover politically, they recover militarily, but they never recover intellectually and
Hmm.
even economically. That's why I said problems began before of this Mongol crusade and Timur invasions. So the invasions, in fact, provide support to Ulema state alliance, because when you are under survival threats, when you see massacres and killings of Mongols and Crusaders, you turn your face to a military hero like Saladin, like Mamluks. You don't search for paintings and musics and art. No, you need a military hero to defend you. That's how the foreign attacks even strengthened in military alliance. And in the 13th and early 14th century, there was a very influential Muslim scholar, Ibn Taymiyyah. Today, he is a source of inspiration for Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia and Salafism elsewhere. And in the Quran, there is a phrase, ulul amri minkum,
Yes.
those who have authority among you. And for centuries, this was interpreted in a broad way. Those who have knowledge, expertise, education, authority in different terms. Ibn Taymiyyah says this verse refers to ulama and umara. So the ulema and state authorities, umara, amir, plural umara. So he then justified ulema state alliance referring to Quran. And still very influential, the book he wrote, Governance Based on Sharia, his famous book. But despite the ulema state alliance, Muslims were still producing cutting-edge philosophers. Ibn Rushd, 2 centuries after him, Ibn Khaldun. But these philosophers have been mostly forgotten because of the stagnation and decline in intellectual curiosity. For example, today we have Ibn Rushd's commentary to Plato's Republic, a very important political theory book. We can only read it in English because the only Hebrew original stay today. The Arabic original was burned and destroyed and forgotten. So yes, Muslims were still able to produce important thinkers, but at the same time, these thinkers were undermined, attacked, and forgotten because of the ulema state alliance and how it marginalized thinkers. And finally, ulema state alliance marginalized merchants. In Egypt, for 5-6 centuries, there were major merchants, many of them called Kerimi merchants, and the Mamluks, as a military oligarchy, confiscated certain properties and marginalized and ended this century-old intercontinental trade-making merchant class in Egypt too. So you see, starting Central Asia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and finally North Africa, ulema state alliance, intellectuals and merchants marginalized. And we have some data in Egypt, for example, occupational terms. Go ahead.
Can I just share something from the
Of course.
that you wrote in the book? One of the really critical things which is really dominating the world even today, and there's this big debate, is that there is a particular interpretation in jihadi Salafism, as you write, and which has promoted violence primarily because it is based on the idea that one single Quranic verse, and this has been used by Daesh and ISIS and Tariqa-Taliban Pakistan and Boko Haram, all these things that about attacking non-believers in Mecca. There is this one verse of the Quran, which according to them abrogates hundreds of verses in the Quran. It makes the subsequent verses in the Quran about peace and patience and toleration and freedom of conscience non-operational. So they have used this one verse to abrogate a huge part of the Quran and justify their killing of non-believers. I think that is one point that you make very solidly. I think the other point is, where this concept of doing good and commanding right and forbidding wrong, the Nahi al Mulkar, this again is a extremely it has caused a lot of problems because commanding right and wrong is fine, but once you put these ideas into contemporary societies, as you mentioned, you would need a dictator at the top, an authoritarian regime, which would say, this is how you do it, this is what you will do, this is how you will talk, this is what you will write, this is what you will speak, and there's going to be anarchy. So this concept of commanding right and forbidding wrong, according to you, needs a much more modern interpretation to become compatible with democracy, individual freedom, and modern day and beyond. I just wanted
Thank
to.
you. And let me follow up very briefly.
Yes.
Your 2 points are very important because what we are analyzing here as historical have huge contemporary implications.
Yeah.
This is not history. This is what we live every day.
Yes.
This is what we have today in the Muslim world. Because you mentioned 2 things. One, the abrogation. Ibn Taymiyyah was very influential and he reacted. He was a reactionary. He reacted to crusaders. He reacted to Mongols. That's why he issued fatwas about possibility of killing a Muslim ruler if he does not follow Sharia.
Right.
This is an unfortunate fatwa because one should not issue fatwa to killing anyone. And why did he do that? Because of his hostility to Mongols. At that time, Mongol rulers converted to Islam, but Mamluks were still in fight with them. So some Muslims says Mongols converted to Islam, the ruling class of Mongols. Why are we still fighting? Then the Mamluks need a fatwa. Then Ibn Taymiyyah issued a fatwa saying that, sorry, they are Muslim by faith, but they don't follow Sharia. So it was a particular specific fatwa in order to justify an ongoing war. And if you know the horror of Mongols,
Yes.
it makes sense today in 13th century maybe, but
Yes.
today in
Not
2020 to pick up that fatwa and say, oh, this ruler is not following Sharia, Ibn Taymiyyah say I can kill it. This is mind-blowing. It's really hard to understand. This is one thing. Then Ibn Taymiyyah has a student, Ibn Qayyim Jawzi. And this Jawziyah is a major scholar with a very wrong idea. He said that Prophet defended peace when Muslims were weak. When Muslims became stronger, no need for the peaceful coexistence. Then Sayyid Qutb pick up this idea from this student of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, and he said, look, the real message of Islam is offensive, violent. When Muslims at the beginning were weak, they defend peace. That's why they argue that with one verse, you can abrogate 140 verse about peace and compassion and everything in Islam. So, first of all, this means hypocrisy. It means that Muslims are hateful people. They don't love peace. If you follow this logic, no one would love to coexist with Muslims. We cannot build trust. We cannot build friendship with other people because they will always say, oh, you are weak today, but one day you'll be stronger. Then you'll be offensive. Huh? No, I think Ibn Taymiyyah and his Jawziyah was reacting to Mongols. Their ideas were radical. Today, we should not imitate them. Even Sayyid Qutb wrote this book, Milestones, with radical ideas in a dungeon. In prison, they torture him. He saw how other Muslim brothers were killed and tortured. He wrote this book, but Islam is for peace. You cannot abrogate 140 verses with a single one. And that single verse, as you exactly point out, was only for pagans in Mecca under certain circumstances.
So, Doctor, I'll let you continue with your slide presentation. We're at 53 minutes. We will go about 15 minutes over time. So
Okay.
we have
And very briefly about the second issue, Emre bil Maruf Nehyanil Münker, from Mawardi to Ghazali, they have their ideas from that time. Today, we should make these ideas compatible with democratic liberal values. Otherwise, we can have a peaceful connection with Muslims, Christians, etc. Thank you. So let's continue now the historical analysis. The occupational terms shows us here that in the golden era from 8th to 11th centuries, Muslims had 200, so the occupational terms and the Muslim world right now at that time, a scholar analyzed them, Shas Miller 1993. When we compare, you see in the table, about commerce, the numbers slightly decline, not major change. But about ulama state, a major jump. As you see here, around from 100 to 500. What do I mean by occupational terms? For example, bank manager, CEO, etc. in a company. It showed that economically, Muslims did not have a complexity, a division of labor, more terms. But when it comes to state, many new terms because they have resources, focus, concentration. When it comes to ulama, new resources, new occupations, new money, and division of labor. This shows how economic stagnation and the rise of state ulama alliance comparing the golden era and the 12th to 15th centuries. After the 15th centuries,
This is mind-boggling. This is
yeah,
mind-boggling. The merge.
after the 15th centuries came the three empires, Ottoman, Safavi, Mughal. They recover politically, militarily. But what about intellectual life? What about economy? That is 15 to 18th centuries, or 1500 to 1800 was the time of Renaissance, Reformation, printing revolutions, scientific revolution, enlightenment. That's the revolutionary moment for Europe. And Europe used three instruments: gunpowder, nautical compass, and printing press. But unfortunately, out of the three, Muslim empires only pick and use gunpowder. Why? Because the Ulema State Alliance had the military commanders in the negotiation table in the policy making process. And the military commanders knew the importance of gunpowder. They were right. But who would understand the importance of nautical compass? Because Ottomans has a navy, but for military, it didn't have a commercial fleet. Mughals and Safavis are even more land-based, army-based empires. And then the printing press, the ulama were supposed to understand the importance, but they look it as a threat. That's why for about 3 centuries, from 1455 to 1729, Muslims didn't have a printing press. 18th century, the Ottomans took it first, published printed books, but I compared the numbers. In 18th century, the number of books copies printed in Ottoman printing press around 50,000. In the same century in Western Europe, the number of books copies printed 1 billion. It's not 1 million, it's 1 billion.
1 billion
So
compared
1
to
billion, 20,000 times more, 50,000 versus 1 billion. It shows the intellectual gap. It shows the education, scholarly contribution gap. And what is the result? Look at the literacy rate. Around early 19th century in the Ottoman Empire, this is an estimate number. The estimate literacy rate in 1800 Ottoman Empire, 1%. When at that time, Western Europe estimated average literacy rate 31%. So then came colonization. As you see in this map, Russian colonization, British colonization, French colonization, even a country as small as Netherlands colonized a country as big as Indonesia.
Can I ask? Can I
Of
just make
course, go ahead.
the previous slide? You can stick to this slide. Dr. Ahmed, when you and I were having a conversation a couple of days ago, you mentioned something which was so stark. You said, "Imagine if the Muslim world today, for 3 centuries, did not have the mobile phone and internet, and the Western world had it." That was the impact of the Muslim world not having the printing press or not allowing the printing press to be used for 3 centuries,
Yeah.
while the rest of the world was printing millions and millions and millions of books.
That's a good comparison. Yes, very, yeah. Highlighting very unfortunate internet, mobile telephone. Yes.
Okay.
So now, as you see, colonization of the world, not the Muslim world, but everywhere Europeans colonized, but it came after our intellectual and economic stagnation and contributed further to the problems. Finally, the reform. If we now discuss that ulema state alliance was a problem, Muslims had an intellectual and economic stagnation. And didn't anyone know that in the 19th century? Yes, of course they knew. They knew in Istanbul, they knew in Cairo, they knew in Delhi, in the today's Turkey, Egypt, subcontinent, Indian Muslims, Egyptian Turks. They tried to modernize, but these modernizations mostly, not totally, but mostly failed because they were very much bottom up, state led, with military leaders in Turkey and Egypt from Ottoman Tanzimat starting 1839 to all the way Kemal's reform of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, it still kept economy and intellectual life under state control. Muslims did not have a bottom-up intellectual and bourgeois revolution. And then came modern governments establishing new forms of alliance with the ulama. In Iran, you have the Islamic Revolution. In Egypt, the military rulers established an alliance with Al-Azhar and Mufti. And in Turkey, governments today, Tayyip Erdogan and before him, they established an alliance with Diyanet, which control 100,000 mosques in Turkey. And in Pakistan, you know better than me, Zia Haq, and then certain level of state ulama alliance. And this brings us to many problems. And this alliance is mostly based on rentierism, because neither the state nor the ulama is a productive class. They always need a rent and outside funding. Historically, the rent was agriculture and land and ikta and tumar system. Today, it's mostly oil and
Oil.
oil revenue.
That's why Saudi
As you
Arabia.
see here, out of 28 oil-rich rentier states in the world, 21 or 22 of them are Muslim majority countries. And these rich, oil-rich countries shape their neighbors too. For example, Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan are oil poor, but they receive funding from Kazakhstan, Russia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan. All of them are oil rich. And this oil money really makes democracy less likely, more difficult to reach, funding ulema state alliance. And Iran and Saudi Arabia and Saudis use oil money all around the world to spread Salafism and their notion of Islam. So to conclude,
Doctor,
Islam does not essentially
can you go
reject
back to the
religion states
can
separation.
you
Go ahead.
go back to the previous slide?
Of course.
I just wanted a clarity on one point. So you stop at 41%. Are you saying that if the oil revenue or agriculture revenue or gas revenue for a state, 40% or above of that comes from these natural resources, you call that a rentier state because the other sources of revenue are taxes, etc.
Exactly. You're right. Thanks for emphasizing. A normal relationship is between state and society is based on tax, and that's what happened in American Revolution. The American revolutionaries told the king of England or United Kingdom, no taxation without representation. You, the king, don't give us representation. Why are we paying tax to you? But now the king of Saudi Arabia can say the opposite. No representation without taxation. You, my people, don't pay me tax. I distribute oil money to you. Why should I give you representation?
Okay. So there is no pressure on them, from the
Yes, no pressure on them.
have a more
And
democratic and equitable system because they own all the revenue and they kind of give it as a sadaqah.
exactly. And the state is like your boss.
The state is
And then
like,
the boss can fire you. You cannot criticize your boss. But if you have money, you pay the tax, then you are the boss.
yeah.
Then the state is the
Then you can
servant.
ask questions. Where
You
is
can
my
ask,
money?
you can criticize, and you can ask, where is my money going? Yeah,
Next.
exactly.
Okay. So please
Next,
continue. Sorry, the next slide.
exactly. So Islam is not the culprit. Islam doesn't even essentially reject religion state separation. There was a separation between Islamic and state authorities in early Islamic history. The Ulema state alliance or Mullah state alliance is a historical construction.
It is
At
not an
some point, it's not from the Quran, it's just an interpretation. As you see, Ibn Taymiyyah interpret very late the Quranic verse. And this is just a historical fabrication. Colonialism is not the primary cause. It, of course, it had a negative impact. But that's not the core of the problem. And institutions are created, authoritarian and ineffective institutions are created by the Ulema State Alliance with the Ulema State Alliance ideology and power. So thanks for listening. And now I'm stopping the share.
So, if you can go back to the, okay, that's fine. Okay.
Or
So,
I can go back. Yeah, it's up
no,
to
no,
you.
that's fine, Dr. Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed, thank you very much. So lucid, so clear.
Thank you.
It just warms my heart. I mean, somebody like me has been waiting for a book like this for decades. Okay, so
Thank you. You are very kind.
I think you've done a great service to the Muslim world and to the ulama. So today, in countries like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, the Muslim world, Malaysia, Turkey, Indonesia, we see semi, while there are semblances of democracy, but we see semi-authoritarianism. We also see a huge influence of the ulama or the mullah in the way the state is run. In Pakistan, people have been killed, assassinated for blasphemy. In Turkey, people have been imprisoned for going against something. Even Malaysia, there is now moral policing, where people are like the Saudi standard. I think our challenge is how do we allow freedom of intellectual thought in these countries so it doesn't stifle our intellectual, philosophical, scientific, technological progress and economic development, so most of all.
Big question, important one. I think we should start with honesty. We should be truthful, honest people, really seeking for the truth. And if we have problems, we should not cover up the problems. We should accept our problems in order to fix them. And I think Muslims in the West, like Muslims in the United States, Canada, Europe, may have a good service because they have more opportunities, resources. If, for example, I have a critical talk about a Muslim world in Turkey, in Iran, in Egypt, in Pakistan, there may be some censorship. But Muslims in the West have resources that they can produce, write, research. They should take advantage of it and make a contribution to the Muslim world because we live in a global world and Muslims living in non-Muslim countries like India may have a big impact on the Muslim world. That's one thing. And second thing, in social science, we always look at the agent-structure relationship. Agency as individuals will do our best and then look at the structure, big conditions like COVID that mostly not under control. Right now, a major thing is oil money and it's depleting. Oil is depleting, oil prices are going down and consumption, domestic consumption is increasing. It will be less likely for Saudi Arabia and Iran and others to use oil money as they did before. This is a good opportunity. There will be more need for private sector companies, economic entrepreneurship with less and less oil money coming. And if the Muslim world, at least in some cases, finally have a vibrant economic class and produce a productive intellectual class, these two classes may really lead a new way. And Muslims should really stop being obedient and blindly following the mullahs and the state. They should look at themselves as individuals. They should look at and pay attention to intellectuals and economic. Unfortunately, in many cases, there is a propaganda against intellectuals saying that, oh, they are not good Muslims, they are too much Western brainwash. And this propaganda starts centuries ago. Ad hominem attacks against Ibn Sina, Farabi, oh, these philosophers are all immoral, etc. So, to sum up, then we as Muslims in Western countries have a responsibility. Hopefully, the structure will change, giving us some opportunities, and we should take advantage. And Muslims should stop blindly following the mullahs and state. They should give some credit to intellectuals and economic entrepreneurs.
Dr. Ahmed, thank you so much once again. I mean, clearly you have defined something so starkly that this battle between the intellectuals is not a battle that started today by so-called liberals, as they are called, but this was a battle that started, after the 11th century, when the Muslim intellectualism was at its peak. And even then, these people were considered agnostic or kafir, or, and they were banished. So this is not a new debate. The mullah, the ulama, only has this power, which is to declare somebody an apostate, a kafir, a non-believer, to impose their narrow dogmatic view on them. Because our ascendancy, our growth, our peak happened not because of the ulama or the mullah. It happened because of the intellectual and the philosopher. So that I think is the biggest, most powerful message. And I just want to read one last word from your book. You say, for such a reform to take place, Muslims need creative intellectuals and an independent business economic class, which you call the bourgeoisie, who can balance the power of the ulama and the state authorities.
Can I just add one thing? I consider Abu Hanifa and other Islamic scholars who are creative, independent minded as also intellectuals. So that there is a space for ulama too, if
Yes, of course,
they stop being servant of the state and if they become open minded.
open. Dr. Ahmed, thank you very much. I'm sure those who will listen to this will go back hugely enriched and enlightened. Inshallah, hope to have some more conversations with you in the future. Take good care of yourself. Bless you and thank you.
Many thanks. With salam.
Ah.